Welcome to Two Raven session on animism, shamanic journeying, and therapeutic shamanism with Paul Francis. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Kaya.
In this fourth episode, we will talk about places where the veil between shamanic worlds is thinner, which is also the theme of your upcoming course, the Betwixt and Between. It's an intriguing phrase. Can you tell me more about it?
It's about finding the places where things connect up and we can start to heal our separation, really. In modern times, we are hugely more disconnected than our hunter-gatherer animist ancestors were. I mean, they literally lived in nature and so experience themselves as being part of nature, which not many people these days do. And even these days, if we go out into nature, it's no longer wildness in most places. It's been tamed and domesticated. There's very few genuinely wild places left in the world. Even when people are out in nature, I mean, what I observe is a lot of time they're either on their phones or they're talking to somebody else. They're not actually really noticing a lot of what goes on around them. And then again, so even if we do notice something, say, somebody notices some moss or lichen or something, most people these days don't really know what they're looking at. Whereas hunter-gatherers would have known, what that plant signified, which side of the rock it was growing on be significant. They'd know its healing properties. They'd know everything about it. Beyond that, they also experience that thing as being a sentient living thing. And we're completely cut off from that experience generally in modern life. We live in a world of things rather than living entities, really. And this is part of, in modern times, what the author Derek Jensen calls the myth of human supremacy. We kind of think that we're the most self-aware, sentient, intelligent, amazing species on the planet, sort of thing. There's an interesting experiment which was done, which I really sort of think illustrates this. To try to measure sentience, one experiment scientists have done is they'll put a sticker on the forehead of something and then they'll show it a mirror. So if you do that with a human being, obviously they kind of go, what's that sticker doing on my forehead? As do our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos and things. Corvids, crows and ravens will tend to kind of wonder what that is and so on. Slugs won't, on the whole, mice won't, and so on and so on. And obviously carrots definitely don't. So we think these things are not sentient. Was actually, we haven't measured sentience, we've measured self-awareness. We are probably the most self-aware thing on the planet, but it means we're the most boxed in thing, we're the most isolated thing, the most separated thing, the most disconnected thing, because other things are sentient in a much more collective way, much less obsessed with self. As were our hunter-gatherers. Obviously they had a sense of self, but they were much more connected to the whole and to other things as well, and recognized sentience, different kinds of sentience in other things as well. So we're hugely disconnected in that way, but it also extends to our connection with other humans as well. It's not just like we've cut off from the other than human, but are really connected to each other very well. The descriptions of hunter-gatherer cultures in anthropology is these were just better functioning cultures than us. They looked after each other better, they were less egotistical, they were more cooperative, and so on and so on. Most people in this culture live in bubbles, and even when they go out socializing, often people come back feeling even worse, even more lonely and things. And actually, if you look at the statistics, just over the last few decades even, the percentage of people reporting experiencing loneliness is just going up and up and up and up. It's at epidemic levels now. Part of this relates to we've fallen into a very self-centered, egocentric, me-centric way of being. Ian McGilchrist would call a sort of left brain dominated culture. And that is very, very different to how hunter-gatherers experience the world, really. animism is the opposite, really, of that sort of egotistical left brain culture. It's much more about experiencing a deep interconnectedness with the world around us, with other humans, but also with the other than human as well. And the important thing is, this isn't just an intellectual thing, it's actually what they experience.
So to really get animism and shamanism, to really understand it, we need to widen our perception beyond intellectual, beyond analysis. Can you maybe offer some practical ways to do that? Where do we start?
Well, it's about starting to reconnect things, to knit the worlds back together, really. Animism, or shamanism in particular, sometimes described as living with one foot in this world and one in the other, so that the reality of these realms and the shamanic realms sort of runs in parallel, really, and you can move easily and it will between one or the other. And in the shamanic worlds, we do really start to experience this deep interconnectedness and absolutely have the experience of everything around us being alive and conscious and sentient and being able to communicate with them. And so then when we come back to this reality, that feeling stays with us, or that awareness, that knowledge stays with us. So it changes how we are in this reality. It involves learning to spot and pay attention to the places where the separation between the worlds is thin. These are often kind of hidden places or mysterious places, but they're like the cracks between the things, the more defined things or something, the betwixt and between places. And shamans have always been really interested in these places for a number of reasons. I mean, one is they are a portal to the other worlds, and those sort of cracks are a gateway, if you like, that allow us to enter the shamanic realm. But their importance extends way beyond that in ways people don't sometimes realize. When we go into these betwixt and between places, these cracks between the more defined, pinned down things, what we find is that everything is more in flux and fluid and more connected together as well. In those places, things are more malleable, if you like. They're more moldable. We can work with them more. And so that the places where healing and change can happen more easily, usually, as well. But the third reason they're really important is because the experience of being in them is that things are really much more joined up and much more connected. I mean, even physicists say this. It was David I think, the physicist, who wrote a book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order. And he said there's two sort of layers of reality. There's kind of surface reality, where things appear very separate. He called it the explicate reality. But he said, if you drop down to the deeper reality, what he called the implicate reality, he said everything in there is literally connected to everything else. Everything. Bohm said even to the extent that we only knew how to do it, every atom is connected to every other atom in the universe. So you could ask any atom what any other atom in the universe, no matter how far away, is doing, has been doing, and is likely to do next. Like the whole universe is connected up to that extent. Bohm said, if only we knew how to do it. We do know how to do it. Shamans have been doing it for tens or hundreds of thousands of years. So it's a place of deep connection, essentially. Learning to spot these places and understand what they are is a big deal in shamanism, because it helps us to start to heal our separation and aloneness, essentially.
Can you give us some examples of such places?
I mean, one you start with, certainly in the kind of shamanism I teach and practice, is a place called the Axis Mundi, of course. The phrase literally means axis is centre and mundi is worlds. It's the centre of the worlds. It's a place where all the worlds come together, essentially, both this physical reality and all the unseen worlds as well. A place where the veil between them is much thinner. So it's much easier to, in these places, to step into the other realms, essentially. That's why I teach, to start off journeying, you think of an axis mundi, you find an axis mundi, a place where the worlds are connected together. And the weird thing is, you'll have noticed them already. With new students, I say, what you need to do is just think of a place in nature that you know and love, that intrigues you in some way. It could be like a favourite rock or a favourite tree or something. Or, a lot of people have had that experience where you sort of walk in the forest and you suddenly step into a clearing and it just, the hairs on the back of your neck go up a bit or something. And these are magical places, and they're all over the place. It's where this reality is also meeting the shamanic upper world and the lower world as well. So at the axis mundi, you go down a tunnel to the lower world, or you find some way of going up to the upper world and things, so you can step between the worlds. Ideally, the axis mundi needs to be an actual, real physical place in this middle world as well, rather than just a place in your imagination. Because if it isn't, it's not connecting this physical reality up. And that's the whole point of the axis mundi, is to start, it's a place where the worlds come together. Otherwise, it's just an imaginal thing, essentially. Certainly when you start off, it needs to be a place in nature, not human-made. And that's just because the human-created middle world brings a whole pile of murkiness and clutter and things that can just literally get in the way. So if you're looking for a tunnel to go down to the lower world, a gap underneath the roots of a tree is a classic one, or some kind of a cave, or a pool of water you can dive in. That's going to help you get to the lower world much more readily than if you go down a human-made sort of drain or a sewer or something, So ideally somewhere in nature and a real place. The other thing is, people say, am I stuck with my axis mundi, or can it change? No, you can absolutely change your axis mundi. It's absolutely worth exploring different ones as well. They do tend to bring a different feel to the journey. Once you start working with axis mundis and learn to spot them, you'll spot them more and more as you're going out walking in the countryside and more. But you'll start to realise they're actually all over the place. I mean, if I just look around this room, I can see cracks between the bookcase and stuff. And I know I said it should be out in nature, but as you get more experienced and can separate out middle world stuff, it doesn't matter. They're all over the place, including even in sometimes the gaps between what somebody's saying and how they're saying it, which we can come to later. The veils between the worlds are really less thin than you were experiencing them. It becomes much easier to just step between the worlds at will. This separation from this physical reality and then these weird shamanic realms is actually a disorder of modern day life. It's not how shamans or our animist ancestors experienced the world. They did experience the world as being much more interconnected.
A disorder of modern day life. Can you say more about that?
These days, we've kind of become really fixated and obsessed with sort of physical reality, really. And even if people are aware of other realms, there's sort of like this sort of duality, the kind of split as if they're really separate things. And that's not how our animist ancestors experienced the world. So as I said, shamanism or animism is sometimes described as having one foot in this world and one in the other. That's how they walk through the world, with an experience of different realities going on around them, and the ability to focus more on one or the other depending what was important. I mean, obviously, if you're hunting, or a tiger's hunting you or something, you need to be very focused on this physical reality, but then also they could be sensitive to the spirits around them and put both feet in that reality when needed to do some healing and so on. You might listen to this thinking, well, so what? I mean, you might even think that the way they experienced the world in the past might just be childish or primitive even. We call these people primitive people and things, and that we're superior, that we've learned more, we know better, we're wiser, more scientific and so on. If so, then I think it's just worth remembering what has happened since we fell into this obsession with physical reality and denying the reality of the other realms, and fell into this state of was quite extreme separation and isolation and the idea of human supremacy and things. It's led us very rapidly to the Anthropocene extinction. We're now at the point where we're so treating the rest of the world as things and not alive and not with any kind of rights or agency that extinction rates are running at 20 to 200 times higher than normal levels. Animals and plants, if we carry on like this, we could take down 70, 80, 90% of the other species on the planet, may even take down ourselves. Plus, on top of that, the loneliness epidemic, the mental health crisis. In losing that connection with the other worlds, we've lost so much. We've lost our way, essentially. Shamans sometimes say that madness is having both feet stuck in one reality. Most people take that to mean having both feet stuck in the shamanic world would be insanity, which it would. You wouldn't be able to function in this reality at all. It would be impossible. But equally, having both feet firmly stuck in this reality has clearly led to insanity, because what we're doing to the planet is insane.
So animists experience the world as being a much more interconnected place, almost as if everything is a part of a larger whole. Is that right? And can you say more about how we lost our sense of that connection?
Obviously, a certain amount of separation is absolutely essential to function in society or in the world. You have to have a sense of self. And of course, hunter-gatherers, experienced a sense of self. What's happened, though, is that around about the time of the birth of what we laughingly call civilization, the birth of city-state cultures, the left hemisphere of the brain, which is obsessed with the physical world and self, was the right hemisphere's much more concerned with connection. The left hemisphere basically seized control and became dominant. I mean, Emil Gilchrist writes about this in his book, The Master and His Emissary, and so on. And Steve Taylor talks about egomania. So we live in a culture of egomania, essentially, where that our left hemisphere is in charge and perceives the world in quite a separated, boxed off, materialistic, quite mechanistic way of being. To understand this a bit more, well, in modern physics, they talk about something called collapsing the wave potentials. So there's the famous double slit experiment, where you have a sheet of metal with two slits in it, and you shoot an electron at this slit. And what this experiment shows is that at a sort of quantum level, the electron can exist in two quite different states. So at one level, it's a wave. And when it's like that, it can actually pass through both slits simultaneously. Okay, it can pass through 10 slits simultaneously. But a weird thing happens is, as soon as you start to observe it closely, it becomes a single physical thing, a particle, and then it can only pass through one slit or another slit. It's like it's had all its options boxed off. It's kind of collapsed into a boxed off, more separate thing. That's absolutely, and shamans have always understood this, this is the nature of the middle world. Things are much more separated off. To become physical, things have to collapse all the potential for what they could be and become this thing as opposed to that thing, as opposed to that thing. That's part of the nature of the middle world. That's fine. The problem is the extent to which we do this these days. In modern times, we've collapsed things completely down and then just experience things as their collapsed state and separation. An example being the wonderful Robin Wall Kimmerer in her beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass. She's a scientist, a botanist, I think, but also an Indigenous North American and a brilliant author. So in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, there's a wonderful chapter where she talks about language. And she was brought up not actually speaking her original indigenous tongue. She had to, as an adult, had to learn it. And in going through the process of learning it, she realizes her indigenous language itself is full of interconnectedness and fluidity compared to English, American English, which is everything's blocked off and deadened. So for instance, she gives an example. We talk about the river or a river. Now, for us, that's not only a thing, it's also not an alive thing. It's literally just a thing. In her language, they talk about being a river, or something is being a rock. So there's this sense of this interconnectedness that is just at the moment, part of it is just experiencing being this thing or being that thing. That boxing up of things is something that happens more and more and more as we fall, and our left brain seizes more and more control, essentially. So that's essentially how we lost this sense of connection, really.
So animists live with a sense of interconnection, and that was reflected in their language. Are there any other ways in which their society reflected their experience of interconnectedness?
Yes. The difference Robin Kim was talking about modern American English colonial language, essentially, and her original indigenous language, doesn't just reflect their different experiences of the world. It wasn't just that indigenous people used a more interconnected language because they experienced the world in a more interconnected way. This is the key thing. Language actually determines our experience as well. It's like a two-way process. Language will literally lock down your experiences. So language is one thing. We are, as human beings, born in a way with a sense of individuality. We're born being this baby as opposed to that baby, sort of thing. And as humans, we're a storytelling species, and we're not born like a lot of animals, within an hour of being born, they kind of know what to do, sort of thing. We have to go through a very long period of learning what to do for years and years, which is a lot about learning about yourself and learning about society and your relationship with society and so on. The thing with kids is children are inherently pretty mostly self-centered. I mean, we have to teach kids to share and things, and that other people matter and so on. That's a process of that socialization. All indigenous cultures really understood this. They also understood that a healthy adult wasn't like that. A healthy adult had one foot in self-awareness, but one foot in interconnectedness, essentially, as well. Obviously, each adult in a hunter-gatherer culture would have a sense of self. Equal to that was their sense of interconnectedness, their sense of being part of tribe, of humans, but then also being part of the other than human as well, being part of a bigger family, other animals, the plant people, the stone people, and so on. Whereas in our culture, most people just have a sense of self. And if they do have a sense of community, it's, a few friends or something, possibly a bit with the other than human, maybe their dog or cat or something. But with hunter-gatherers, it would be like 50-50 split between sense of self and sense of interconnectedness. Us, it's, at best 5%, 10%, some people hardly at all. And that's because that's what it's like to be a child. Hunter-gatherers recognise that in order to become adults, something had to happen to shock you out of that, to grow you up. So they had what were known as the rites of passage into adulthood. The thing is that we've lost all knowledge of these. We just pretty much don't do them, not in any meaningful sense. The result is most people in this culture are children in adult bodies. There's quite a few people through psychotherapy and things get to be probably high-functioning adolescents at best. But true adults, they're very rare. In hunter-gatherer cultures, they really understood that that's what will happen unless something dramatic happens to shock you out of your childhood into being an adult. So they had these rites of passage. A huge amount of time and energy was put into these. They were really essential to the culture. They were about essentially putting down that sense of childhood entitlement and separateness and really taking your place as a member of a community, and what can I give to community? And this is really crucial. So that community extended to the other than human too. In psychotherapy, the humanists, people like Maslow, they have this idea of like a fully functioning person or an actualized person. And a lot of the qualities of that are pretty much how hunter-gatherers would experience an adult, with a crucial difference. To be fully adult, you had to be connected to the other than human as well in hunter-gatherer terms. So unless you make that step, you're at best, you're a healthy adolescent. You haven't, to become adult, you need to connect beyond the human as well. So these rites of passage were very important. And it wasn't just adulthood. They had ceremonies for any transitions, basically, for pregnancy, for birth, for becoming an elder, for marriage, for divorce, for death, all sorts of things. Their whole culture was really based around managing these transition periods because they recognized the power of them. These betwixt and between places are powerful. Shamans have always understood this. They're both important and useful, but also they need managing well.
Can you maybe offer some insight of how they were done, especially the rite of passage into adulthood?
Anthropologists, of course, have studied many different versions of these in different cultures. So there was an anthropologist called Van Gennep who coined this phrase rites of passage for them. And he basically said that these rites of passage break down into 3 phases. So one is separation. So you have to be cut off from what was familiar. Okay. So in the rites of passage of being an adult, different cultures would do different things, but your normality and the things you take for granted would be deliberately disrupted. You would have to wear your clothes back to front or inside out. You would have to stand up when everybody else sat down and sit down when everybody else stood up. You'd have to walk backwards, or the whole community would just ignore you as if you just didn't exist, as if you were a ghost nobody could see. All sorts of things. They involved prolonged periods of fasting, sometimes the use of hallucinogenic plants, lots of things to shock you out of everything you'd taken for granted up to this point. The second phase, which was really, it's the most interesting one, I could feel like the hair's going up the back of my neck even thinking about it, is transition. And this is it's sometimes called the liminal phase. It's a phase where everything is in flux. It's almost like what you've done is uncollapse the wave potential, that you're now back to being a wave, not an individual particle. It's like everything now is full of potential and flux and interconnectedness, and almost anything can happen in this phase. That's why this is very carefully managed in these cultures. It was a phase where you were essentially being taken apart and reformed, a bit like what happens to a caterpillar in a pupae, in a chrysalis or something. It's a complete transformation, really. And then you emerge as something different into the third phase, and this is reincorporation. And this, again, the culture would have lots of knowledge they would now pass on to you. Now you're an adult or whatever it is you now are. Lots of ceremonies, you'd be welcomed in a different role, and so on and so on and so on. And these were really central to these cultures. They really understood the importance and power and necessity of managing these transitions well, which is knowledge we've pretty much lost, really.
So how can we regain our sense of interconnection again?
There's a lot of ways, and really doing that is at the heart of shamanic and animist practices. One important way is to start to recognize the importance and the power and the potential as well in these betwixt and between places. So just go back to the axis mundi, just a simple one. I mean, the obvious thing about it, like I said, is it gives you an access point to start to enter the shamanic realms. When you do that, you realize that there is vastly more going on beneath this surface physical reality, and that's in itself is completely mind mind-boggling and mind-opening for people. But people can still get stuck in sense of self and separation. That's kind of what people usually initially bring to it. So I see students being completely wowed by, you know, what they're discovering behind surface reality and amazed by the shamanic realms, but they're still very much, it's like their experience is like, oh, this is me having this experience, like now I am being a tree or something. They're not being a tree, they're being a human being, having a glimpse into what it's like to be a tree, and so on and so on. And if people go deeper, that starts to drop away. If you can get out of being yourself more and then start to actually experience other things and experience that interconnectedness that you experience in the other realms, over time it starts to loosen your attachment to separation. More time you experience in the shamanic realms, which are so interconnected, even when you come back to this reality, you hold that sense of separateness and self-identity much more lightly. You start to realize as well, if you go deeper still, it's like across the board, really, that what you were, before you started this, were experiencing as sort of very separate, defined, physical, you know, there's this thing and there's that thing. You start to experience that sense of interconnectedness that David Bohm talked about. Everything is actually connected up. And it literally does apply to everything. I mean, just take your human body. You have more gut bacteria than you have human cells. And if you think there's gut bacteria where you would die, essentially, they're as essential for you as your human cells. So who are you? Are you your human cells, or are you the gut bacteria? You're actually an ecology yourself. Yeah. The mitochondria in every cell of your body reproduces separately from human DNA. It's actually another organism that our human cells sort of engulfed and developed this symbiotic relationship, but it actually is a different being to us.
Wow.
Well, when I say us, who are you then? Are you the human DNA or are you the mitochondria? It's a good question. Yeah. So, you know, the sense of I and self, it's like when you start drilling down into it, it starts to fall away, really. And the thing is, in journeying, you actually start to experience this. It's not just an intellectual thing. Think about a beach. Where does the beach end and the land begin? It's like, at what point is there no grain of sand left? A few hundred yards, miles. You know, when it rains here, sometimes we have sand falling from the Sahara Desert. It's like, where does the Sahara beach end? You know, it's like, it's just not that defined. Or think about the wall between the wall and the ceiling. Behind you. Where does the wall end and the ceiling begin? It's like, if you start looking down more precisely in things, and particularly if you start getting down to the subatomic level of things, it's really, there isn't a wall and a ceiling. And in any case, they're simply human constructed concepts. You know, your whole sense of separation starts to loosen, and eventually this starts to apply to your sense of self as well. You start to realize that there isn't really a single I. In this culture, we have this completely mistaken identity that a healthy adult is an independent being, someone who can stand on their own 2 feet, sort of thing. For hunter-gatherers, a healthy adult is somebody who really gets interdependence, gets how much they are actually part of a community. They are a twig on a branch of a bigger tree. For that twig to declare independence would be nonsensical and suicidal for it, which is what we're doing. Basically, we've declared independence to the rest of the world, and you know, it's falling to shit basically because of it. And that interconnectedness really for hunter-gatherers extends to the other than human as well. They do understand, you know, that their life depends on other things. It's like another example. We talk about trees and then forests as if like there's such a thing as a tree. Trees literally their life is completely dependent on their symbiotic relationship the RITES have with fungi, the mycelium network. Without that exchange, trees die. So at what point is it a tree or the fungus? It's, where does that end? And then if you look at the mycelium network, it attaches every tree in a forest to every other tree. So forests aren't what we think of as collections of individual trees. It's an organism on another level. It's like the trees in it are cells in a larger organism. And that's very much how hunter-gatherers experienced the world. They were cells with a function in a much larger body, essentially.
You've been talking about this from an animist shamanic perspective so far. I'm aware, though, that what you teach, therapeutic shamanism, draws from psychotherapy too. What does psychotherapy say about the betwixt and between places?
Well, yeah, many things, actually. So give you a couple of examples. What a lot of people don't realize is that most of the time, like 99% of the time, what takes people into therapy are human relationship wounds. That's why people go to therapy, is because they've been hurt or are angry or something from other people, essentially. So what a lot of people think is that therapy is about techniques or practices or something, or about information or something. And some therapies do operate at that kind of simple level, but really it's a relational thing, because it's relational wounds. As a therapist, I'm very integrative and collective. I'm not sort of a purist, but at the heart of my psychotherapy work is Carl Rogers' work, person-centeredness. And he really understood that really what is healing, or what's fundamental to healing, is relationship between the therapist and the client. So he came up with the concept of what he called the core conditions, that the therapist has to show empathy, non-judgmentalness, kindness, and they have to be a real person who the client can be in real contact with, and so on. That interconnectedness and relationship is essential to therapy. Clients come in with content. He said this, and then I did that, and their stories. If, as a therapist, you just stick with that surface story, not a lot's going to happen, really. The client will probably feel they've let off steam and had a good moan, and they'll feel a bit better for it. But that's not therapy at depth. What that is collapsed wave potentials. Okay. And what we want to get to is the uncollapsed wave. The way to that as a therapist is you start to notice and train yourself to notice the gaps between what somebody is saying and how they are saying it. So somebody might be saying something that's really sad, but then laughing it off. Or they're saying, they weren't bothered by something, and clearly they were. Or their tone of voice doesn't match what they're saying, or their body language doesn't match what they're saying. In therapy, we call these double signals. Okay, there's a gap. And they're axis mundis. So in therapy, when I'm working with the clients, initially you have to establish that relationship. So practicing the core conditions, make sure you show empathy, unconditional positive regard, non-judgmentalness, all that stuff is absolutely essential. You won't get anywhere deep without that. But doing that involves listening to a lot of content. He said this and I did that. I know that's not actually therapeutically interesting. Nothing's going to happen in that place. It's just a way of being in a relationship. So what I'm looking out for all the time is something odd. It's like if you were tracking something in a wood and you'd look for twig that's broken that doesn't seem like it's just a normal thing. Something's done that or something. You train yourself to start spotting these double signals, these gaps between things. And those are literally, if the client is willing to go with you, things, that's where you plunge into. Those are your access points to something deeper. So yeah, betwixt and between places are the key to deep therapy work, absolutely.
Wow, fascinating. Could you say a little more about the other betwixt and between places you will explore?
On the course about betwixt and between, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so shamanism is absolutely not just about shamanic journeys. So there's a lot of other practices have their place as well. And although shamanism and psychotherapy are different, I'm absolutely clear about that. When psychotherapy does go beneath the surface and into these altered states of consciousness, into these betwixt and between places, there's a lot of interesting overlap then with shamanism. It's like they sort of intersect at that point. So obviously, as well as shamanic journeying, I'm going to be teaching techniques, or a technique in particular, from psychotherapy that's a different way into these things. It's from the work of a guy called Eugene Gendling, who developed this system called focusing. What Gendling was interested in, he didn't really believe therapists' explanations of how therapy worked. So what he did was he studied hundreds, probably thousands of video recordings of therapy, trying to look what's actually happened there. And what he found was essentially the axis mundi point. There was a point where people moved away from all their content, more into the body, more into what he called felt sense. And in doing that, people move into kind of an altered state of consciousness. And then they start to have to use, to describe it, work with it, they have to use imagery or metaphor or symbolism of things in the same way we do in a shamanic journey, in a way. And he discovered that's where the real change happens. That's where the deeper change happens. So the beauty of Gendling, his genius was he distilled this down into a extremely simple and effective technique that's quite easy to learn, and just brilliant. I mean, it's really central to my life. It has been for 40 years or so now. In a more sort of conventional shamanic way, we'll look at the betwixt and between places in journeying and what they're about. So one thing is we'll look at the seashore and what that means, because it has deep symbolism and meaning and teaching and healing gifts. And also what we'll be looking at is the transition between things and really slowing that down and getting a sense of what you're moving from and what you're moving towards. So for instance, if in a journey you are moving from the land to the sea, that's got a very different meaning and teaching from if you were in the sea and then emerge onto the land. And the same with the movement between other realms as well, like the movement between land and sky. And then we'll be looking at the animals that do that. So birds, obviously, but we'll be looking at insects in particular on the course, because insects are fascinating. I mean, they are masters of transformation, essentially. Most insects have 4 very different phases in their life. So they start off as an egg, and then they spend time as some kind of a pupary, caterpillary sort of thing. And then they have some kind of cocooning process, and then they emerge as something completely different. They have a lot to teach us about understanding and managing rites of passage, essentially. Sea mammals, animals that, came out of the sea onto land and then have gone back into the sea. I mean, that's a very fascinating thing to have done. If you come across a mountain journey, there's a difference between going up a mountain and descending it. It's like, well, what's that mean? So we'll look at all these things and then look at them as rites of passages as well, because essentially a rite of passage is you need to be willing to be taken apart. You need to be separated from the old and the familiar and your collapsed wave potentials, and to be willing to enter this extraordinary realm where everything is in flux, this liminal realm of potential and things, and be comfortable in that and know how to navigate that, and then how to come back and bring that knowledge and healing into the world. And that is absolutely, of course, what being a shaman was. Shamans, more than anybody in ancestral cultures, were the people who were most taken apart deliberately, who were most willing to go through that process. So Yeah, we'll explore all those things on the next course, essentially.
Great. Sounds exciting. So this course is a next step course. People need to do the first steps first?
They do, yeah. Yeah, even if people have done other shamanic training, there's many different approaches to shamanism. And from past experience, when we've allowed people to skip our first steps course, they get lost, essentially. There's a lot of unlearning people often have to do to learn this particular approach. It's a bit like, if you've learned Aikido, you can't just step into a master judo class or something. You have to learn the basics as well again. So if you're interested in the BETWIXT and Between course, that starts in March. And we do have a first steps course starting in February 2023. So you can do that first and then go on to the next steps course straight. I think there's probably a week gap or something.
Wow, this was mind stretching. Thank you, Paul. So see you in 2023, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kai. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.